18th century Arminian anti-slavery actually anti-racist? While Arminian theological anthropology may be evident in Wesley's anti-slavery stance toward the American colonies described in his Thoughts Upon Slavery, it does not follow of necessity that his stance, and that of the itinerant preachers whom he sent to America from 1769 on, was anti-racist. Uncritical contemporary championing of John Wesley today as a proto-activist for civil rights and full racial equity misses the limitations that lenses such as those of empire and racialization place on theological vision, even vision of the broad availability of grace. Before I proceed to address the question my title asks, it is necessary to name and to clarify what is meant by the terminology that is not germane to Methodist studies, anti-racist. It is also helpful to identify what elements of an expressed stance may prevent it from being anti-racist. This step will make it possible, as promised, to present and recognize evidences of remaining racism in the abolitionism of Wesley and his inheritors in the late 18th and early 19th centuries, before noting some possibilities for identifying our own lingering prejudices and augmenting anti-racism today. For terminological clarity, I turn to two contemporary anti-racist scholars who work on opposite sides of the Atlantic, but who are on a similar page, for both of whom racism awareness and not racist are insufficient, and ultimately produce pointless, even violent pushback, rather than societal transformation, true liberation, and lasting caring change. Ibram X. Kendi emphasizes people and policy, stating, an anti-racist idea is any idea that suggests the racial groups are equals in all their apparent differences, that there is nothing right or wrong with any racial group. Anti-racist ideas argue that racist policies are the cause of racial inequities. Anthony G. Reddy has analyzed his own work in racism awareness from the vantage point of a decade since ending such trainings, and with the perspective of the clamoring for change occasioned by the death of George Floyd, which clamor may be seen as a culmination of the global Black Lives Matter movement. In doing so, Reddy recognizes that actual anti-racism, rather than mere racial awareness or even unconscious bias training, requires a deconstruction or dismantling of the violent project of whiteness that Christianity writ large, let alone the Methodist movement and its subsequent churches, long has been. Reddy previously had observed that although the 1807 Act abolished the slave trade, it did not end the institution of slavery itself, let alone end racism, notions of white supremacy, or the demonization of Blackness, Black people, and Africa. Both make clear that anti-racism requires decoupling from rugged individualism on one hand, and refraining from broad brush painting of artificially defined groups on the other. Thus, any stance toward slavery that employs racial paradigms, calls for colonization, or perpetuates white supremacy, however subtly, cannot serve anti-racist ends and thus remains racist. For all the proto-anti-racist potential in Wesley's Thoughts Upon Slavery that has been well documented by David Fields, Daniel Pratt Morris Chapman, and Irv Brendlinger, there remains evidence of empire that upheld and still upholds racial racist constructs. In Reddy's words, the bitter truth is that Black lives have not mattered for a very long time, and the church has long been complicit in this. This statement echoes Reddy's call for dismantling white supremacy at the heart of what he calls mission Christianity. Pratt Morris Chapman has helpfully sorted Methodist inheritors of Wesley in America into racist pro-slavery, racist anti-slavery, and immediate abolition positions. But one of my goals is to demonstrate how the lack of fulsome anti-racism in initial anti-slavery impacts even this last group, immediate abolition. made up primarily of African Americans inspired by the writings of John and Charles Wesley, as lesser known as Daniel Coker and as famous as Richard Allen, but still working within the racializing framework. While Wesley willingly writes within this framework, in his Thoughts Upon Slavery of 1774, he presses beyond it in a number of ways. True, even when speaking constructively, he uses categories of Blackness and whiteness, and the typical terms of the day for Black persons. And when framing negative comparisons, he uses no longer acceptable terminology for Muslims and other non-Christians. Nevertheless, over and against problematic biblical arguments, he proceeds setting the Bible out of the question and opposes slavery based on what he advances as basic tenets of natural law, such as liberty, testing every aspect of the transatlantic slave trade through a lens of justice, mercy, and truth. In sharp contrast to the sentiments of many of America's founding fathers, Wesley intones, certainly the African is in no respect inferior to the European, though David Field's presentation at the beginning of this conference problematizes his imaging, and identifies several key technologies of white supremacy, even if not using that phrase. He denies the claim that Africans must be enslaved because they are suited to a level of toil white Europeans could not bear, by recalling his own experience with his English and German companions of becoming suited to heavy labor by clearing trees in the hot Georgia sun. Decrying the slave ship captain's bribing of Africans to wage war on their own people, Wesley directly calls those involved in the trade, whether captains, merchants, or planters, to dismantle their own economic system. Without directly naming Arminian concepts of free will and grace, he still rings downright radical at points, insisting that no one can be born a slave, as liberty is the right of every human creature, and no human law can deprive humans of that right that is derived from the law of nature. Such statements make all the more astonishing his getting American independence wrong in Pratt Morris Chapman's read. Before turning attention to that matter, it is necessary to identify basic limits even within Thoughts Upon Slavery that bring him up short of what might be deemed full-fledged Wesleyan anti-racism, even amid the call to honor liberty and the laws of justice, mercy, and truth. Whereas the letter Wesley writes during his final days on earth to William Wilberforce urges the renowned abolitionist politician in his policy work, in Thoughts Upon Slavery 17 years earlier, Wesley dismisses the value of an appeal to Parliament. After all, he notes, so many things which seem of greater importance lie before them, that they are not likely to attend to this, meaning the argument for ending slavery. Perhaps Wesley is being wry. Instead, he appeals, as I've already noted, directly to those who are more immediately concerned, whether captains, merchants, or planters. Not only does this approach fall far short of Kendi's definition of anti-racism that is rooted in replacing racist policy with anti-racist policy, and that dares anyone who would be anti-racist to think boldly and immediately. It also contradicts what might be expected to follow from Wesley's own theological position on the doctrine of original sin. While the moral image of God in humanity is destroyed irrevocably apart from grace, vestiges of the natural and political imago Dei remain, however distorted and in need of action to revive and reanimate human relationship. In fact, with the moral imago so permanently damaged, one wonders on what basis Wesley expects fruitful response to his appeal to the captain, merchant, or planter involved in slavery. Whether you are a Christian or no, show yourself a man. Such appeals make all the more bewildering his excoriating use of semantics regarding slavery in addressing colonists seeking liberation from taxation without representation. In his anti-revolutionary tracts, including A Calm Address to Our American Colonies, 1775, and some Observations on Liberty of 1776, Wesley entirely overlooks the pain and alienation evident in colonists' call for independence, and instead hones in on their alleged use of slavery to describe their predicament, according to Samuel Johnson's report in Taxation, No Tyranny. While Wesley, as well as Johnson, may be right to question the legitimacy of applying that term to the suffering of colonists in comparison to the African people some of them are themselves enslaving, his implication that based on their exaggeration, their concerns should be dismissed only hurts his anti-slavery argument. It is this polemical treatment of the colonists' concerns, which Pratt Morris Chapman blames together with American separation of church and state, for American Methodists' failure to take seriously and to retain the strength of Wesley's anti-slavery stance in the first several decades of American Methodism. His scolds laying a foundation that would render all future efforts by Methodist conferences and leaders to enshrine anti-slavery ring like so much British conscience imposed by British leadership. The limiting lenses of empire were, however, worn by plenty of colonists, even without Wesley placing them so actively before their eyes, as racist concessions are evident in even Asbury's earliest expressions of anti-slavery commitment. Racist frameworks are evident in Thomas Taylor's 1768 request that Wesley send Methodist preachers, as well as in Richard Boardman's letter to Wesley the following year about what Ritchie, Rowe, and Schmidt dub the biracial character of Methodism in North America. While no doubt making an effort to fully depict that character in advance, Taylor's letter briefly describes an incident in Jamaica, Long Island, New York, in which 6 months of preaching by a Mr. Webb from his own house and other places brought 24 persons to experience justifying grace, emphasizing the minority who were white before the rest who were Black. Similarly, after Wesley sends Boardman, Joseph Pillmore, and others to the American colonies in response to Taylor's plea, Boardman reports, "They have no preaching in some parts to the back settlements. I doubt not but an effectual door will be opened among them. Oh, may he now give his son the heathen for his inheritance. The number of Blacks that attend the preaching affects me much. One of them came to tell me she could neither eat nor sleep because her master would not suffer her to come to hear the word. She wept exceedingly, saying, I told my master I would do more work than ever I used to do if he would but let me come. Nay, that I would do everything in my power to be a good servant." Boardman's failure to problematize this unjust situation and the lack of record of his interceding for this woman in any way points to the uncomfortable truth that even anti-slavery Methodists quickly accommodated pro-slavery sentiment. Within the Methodist Episcopal Church, that sentiment would eventually result in a pro-slavery faction that developed slave catechisms for slave missions, bent on civilizing and taming the temptation to seek emancipation and freedom on earth by holding out the greater hope of freedom in heaven for obedience on earth. Echoes of this woman whom Boardman quotes in 1769 can be heard in the writings of Pillmore, who accompanied him in a 1771 letter, as well as in the autobiography of Richard Allen, founder of the African Methodist Episcopal Church. Pillmore is content to describe an enslaved Black woman's preference that her mistress beat her severely than that she burn in hell for missing hearing the word of God at a Methodist meeting. When Allen describes his own manner of coming to Methodism prior to his buying his own freedom, he and a fellow enslaved teenager make every effort to show sufficient industriousness to keep from embarrassing their enslaver by failing to accomplish as many tasks on days they go to Methodist society meetings. In addition to bragging about such incidents without problematizing the circumstances of the enslaved, white preachers and even bishops perpetuate racist tropes and actions. Bishop Thomas Coke describes Black lay exhorter Harry Hosier as being given to him by Asbury along with a borrowed horse, calling Hosier his Black, Harry by name. Coke calls Hosier one of the best preachers in the world, but immediately emphasizes his illiteracy and humility, calls him a creature, and marvels that the whites stay to hear him, though Coke advertises him as being there to preach to the blacks. Throughout accounts given by white Methodist preachers, the persistent use of phrases such as poor blacks and little blacks underscore the racialization of the American Methodist mission that prevented its Arminian anti-slavery stance from being fully anti-racist, let alone from thriving in the New World. Official communications of early American Methodism bear much stronger, clearer anti-slavery language, but whether it is sufficiently anti-racist remains in doubt, as the softening of the firm emancipatory demands described in the first Book of Discipline, compiled from the minutes of the 1784 Christmas Conference, is swift thereafter. While this discipline requires slave-holding members of societies to draw up instruments of manumission of all slaves, grouped by age within a specific time frame, to be supervised by an assistant in each circuit and bans from the communion all who refuse, there is already the loophole. These rules are to affect the members of our society no further than as they are consistent with the laws of the states in which they reside. The degree to which even the most ardent anti-slavery advocates also advocate forms of segregation or colonization in the form of sending emancipated persons to Africa is disheartening. In 1800, Coke, Asbury, their fellow bishop, Watcote, and a committee called upon all Methodists to urge their state legislatures to enact emancipation proclamations. But the call either went unheeded or was unsuccessful, as it increasingly became the case in the US, even as some states enacted anti-slavery laws, that the only safe place for a freed person became Canada. Advocates of immediate abolition among the newly forming African Methodist Episcopal and AME Zion churches were forced to create the Underground Railroad primarily with a view to conveying escaped persons across the northern border. African Methodist Episcopal freedwoman and abolitionist Harriet Tubman depended initially on a few white families willing to risk harboring persons fleeing slavery. 50 years after the Christmas Conference and more than 25 years after slavery was legally ended in England, abolitionist clergy in New England still urged an immediate end to slavery in the Methodist Episcopal Church by appealing to the Bible, the discipline, the opinions of Wesley, of Dr. Clark, of Watson, and by the testimony of the British Conference, and the unanimous voice of the Wesleyan connection in England, including the whole of the preachers and people. Once again, stopping short of full anti-racism, however, the steps urged by these immediate abolitionists are: 1, awareness; 2, prayer; and 3, action that immediately frees enslaved persons, but not in such a way that they are thrust out loose upon the nation like a herd of cattle, invested with actual political privilege or rights, nor send them back to Africa. Rather, they suggest a protective system of supervision that lets them enjoy the fruits of their own labor and receive secular and religious instruction. How far Methodists had fallen in 60 years from Wesley's direct appeal to perpetrators of the slave trade. What might Wesley have done differently? We may imagine what might have been possible had he, rather than shaming and scolding the colonists by flat comparison of their non-existent to his mind suffering to that which they or their fellow colonists were inflicting on Africans, instead encouraged them to seek their more marginalized fellow humans' freedom in order to find their own. What if he had helped them to see in the enslaved African struggle for emancipation a shared struggle for liberation? That by fighting for the freedom of the enslaved, by reasoning with fellow colonists or adjusting their own dependence on plantation economy, they might gain companions in their own effort to be liberated from tyranny. Of course, a good Tory would not have put it that way, but he might have seemed less a British puppet of the king to skeptical early American Methodists had he a measure of advocacy and sympathy. My research that led to my forthcoming book began as my wondering if the bold surrender I recognized in Wesley's covenant prayer was traceable to his having read about the concept of believing into Christ, established by Augustine and systematized by later theologians, including Bede and Lombard. and never yet have been able to make that direct connection between Augustine and Wesley, even via Bede. But I now wonder if Wesley's bungling of American independence and its impact on the reception of his anti-slavery stance might have benefited from it. The theology I construct from the concept involves by-believing, not just loving Christ, but cherishing Christ with the delectio love that Augustine tags to love of neighbor, and going into Christ and being incorporated in Christ's members in such a way that believers are glued to Christ by the Holy Spirit. I argue by means of other Augustinian imagery that believers thus move in the direction Christ's members and limbs have always gone, in the direction of the more marginalized than the self, and that believers are thus also glued to one another in such a way that believers are stuck together and cannot help but cherish all other bodies, regardless of whether they look alike, live alike, or love alike, including as believers are reaching in eager love to those not stuck to the body, just as Christ always has. This understanding of believing might have aided Wesley in his address to colonists in their marginalization and their relationship with more marginalized enslaved persons, as well as in his own self-understanding in relationship with the colonists. Such believing as love makes it almost a pleasure to check one's own whiteness and its attendant, to use Dr. Reddy's words from this beginning of this conference, hierarchy of credibility, which ultimately Wesley would have needed to do, as we still need to do it today. We return to Reddy, who challenges Methodism in ways pertinent both to theological education and clergy formation. Deconstructing whiteness and its relationship to mission Christianity represents, I believe, Reddy says, a radical and robust means of developing an anti-racist ethic that can inform and radicalize those training for public authorized ministry.